So I've at length discovered a tight formulation for the transcendentality of Heidegger, which is so unlike the use of the word in the tradition, which is mostly used either for the largest genus, which is then comes into um, contact with the idea of the categories, um, or of uh, what it is thought of in the um, medieval tradition, um, which is very close to that, but it gets it brings in the highest idea at an equal plane. It brings in the good, I think, the good understood as God, or as as Thomas says, the analogy of God, maybe. It brings in the good at about the same level as the categories in Aristotle. Um, Aristotle deals with the good with the first mover. Um, how the first mover stands vis-a-vis the categories is kind of maybe unstated in Aristotle. But in any case, beyond that, we get the transcendental, of course, in the most famous sense, in the condition for any possible experience in Kant. But so Heidegger is using it in a way that does seemingly is the furthest thing away from either of those, and doesn't seem to. It's not as though it made a series leading to that somehow. Like there's three ways, but it seems maybe it's just quite different. As the strict sense is that we're dealing with a who for which there is a world, or we're dealing with the sheer opening. But the sheer opening is always the sheer opening of a who, the Dasein, for which there is a world which is present or available. So the so-called Greek interpretation of being as presence or availability, or that, or also it's not obvious, but also that which the logos can say when the logos is presencing subject matter to itself. Um, so it seems to me we, in the sheer opening of this, which is some insight, I think, comes in Heidegger's early paper on George Berkeley, where he's saying Berkeley isn't a solipsist, because for Berkeley you recognize the you recognize the existence of the other who's, of the other Daseins, then, so that there are other who's every Dasein takes somehow for granted. But then you could say, from within this sheer opening of this claim to transcendence, in the sense that we're not only dealing with the available beings, but also with this claim that there's the who for which it is available in the bare sense. From this opening, we see that we're prompted to look at all these thoughts, to think about them and receive them, as it were, passively. So that thinking in Heidegger, you'll see continually is set off against doing, as Dugin recently called himself a thinker and said, as a thinker, he had this and this view about what should have happened in Ukraine. But as a man of action, Putin had this and this view, and of course, it was, as it were, it was natural that they had different views, because one is passively receiving the availability, and they're thinking over it. So that's like the whole of philosophy is on this side of the passive reception, rather than the Dichter or Dichter's work, the work of the fiction or the writer or the poet, poiesis, the opposite of suffering something, but ac- action, um, is then set against that. Uh, so that thought is not a simple thought. It's difficult to work out then what applies to what, and how can you apply the whole saying that Heidegger is saying, where this Dasein is kind of the product of a thinker. It's a thinker, it's passively receiving, but at the same time, we want to say there's this thought that it has, that there's also an active thing in the so-called ready to hand, rather than the available through this sort of thinking rather than something else, thinking rather than um, action, fusis, rather than the external thing, but also thinking. Heidegger speaks of the thinker and the poet, but where the poet and poiesis is active, maybe the language actively transforming things, um, which is the greatest umbrella around this sheer opening, this Dasein, um, as it were, trickling down the rainy window pane of the Dasein. Here we have also the possibility, although at first glance it's slightly artificial, to set thinking off against feeling, thinking off against sensation, or seeing the parts of something as the basis, rather than seeing the idea of the whole thing, which is spoken, as the main thing, as the form or essence. In other words, the debate between Heraclitus, who takes the side of the parts, or Parmenides, who takes the side of the hen, or the one form. So I think that in thinking Heidegger, one should be more open to do exactly what he says, which is that in this kind of analysis, we might hit some radical ground where we have to change the whole analysis at any moment. So Heidegger actually invites us to, as it were, individuate the Heideggerian teaching. So I was just thinking all of this in the context of these questions of the Ukraine issue, and Dugin has put something out saying against the notion of a legalistic notion of a nation, which I assume he would set off against the ancient sense in which we say the children of Israel, are a nation, or something like, along those lines. So there's a little bit of a usage issue, but I believe it's clear Dugin is speaking here of the modern nation projects, where we're talking about a legal construction above all, and especially a legal construction which suggests that this Rawlsian formula, which is eventually comes out as it talks about the state is going to be totally blind, just like Lady Justice is blind. And in this veil of ignorance, all the citizens can be doing anything, and the state doesn't know about it. It treats all the children equally. The rationalistic notion of the legal technology, as it were, which, by the way, I think is kind of nicely shown in that TV series about the Raised by Wolves. They had something where the robot had a fight with the